If Elijah Brooks had something to say, he usually didn't. Not because he was shy or scared or small, but because words felt wasted when nobody bothered to catch them. He learned early that people liked the sound of their own voices more than they liked listening to anyone else. It was easier to stay quiet, to let the noise of everyone else drown itself out. He lived on the west side of Baton Rouge, not far from Florida Boulevard, in a two-bedroom apartment barely big enough to hold the life crammed inside it. The walls were thin, the neighbors louder than they had to be. His mom, Charlene, worked double shifts at the clinic, wore herself thin trying to hold things together. His older brother, Isaiah, was barely around, swallowed up by crowds Elijah didn't trust and didn't want to understand. But Elijah had music. Not the kind you learned from lessons or played on polished instruments. Not the kind that came with applause or awards. He had an old beat-up keyboard at the rec center a few blocks over, keys chipped and dead in places, power chords sparking if you moved it wrong. Half the time, it didn't even sound right. But it didn't matter. It was the one place Elijah could let everything he carried slip out through his fingers and disappear into the air. Every afternoon after school, Elijah would run to that keyboard, backpack thudding against his side, mind already spinning with sounds waiting to break loose. No sheet music, no fancy techniques, just the sounds inside his head and the weight in his chest spilling out into whatever songs he could find. He played what he felt. Joy when he thought about the cartoons he used to watch with Isaiah before everything changed. Anger when bills stacked up on the counter and Isaiah's voice got sharp and tired. Silence when he didn't know how to name the way everything felt too heavy. Nobody taught him. Nobody showed him where his fingers were supposed to go. But some things don't need lessons. Some things are just already there, waiting. At school, Elijah did what he was supposed to. Kept his head down, stayed out of trouble, made himself small enough that teachers forgot to call on him. Nobody saw the way he tapped out rhythms with the end of his pencil during math tests, or how his eyes shifted when the loudspeaker played the school anthem every morning. Most of the other kids only noticed him when they needed something. Homework answers, a partner for a group project no one else wanted to do, someone easy to pick on when the day got too long. The one place Elijah ever felt seen was inside the music room at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, where Miss Delacroix taught out-of-tune instruments and stubborn kids and still managed to find a way to believe in all of them. She was the only adult who seemed to notice that Elijah wasn't just quiet. He was listening, hearing the world differently, feeling it under his skin. Sometimes she'd catch him humming to himself during lunch or tapping out melodies against the side of his desk. She'd ask him questions he didn't know how to answer at first, not about grades or missing homework, but about chords and scales, about how you tell a story with your hands instead of your mouth. She told him once, after he made up a lullaby for a pretend baby assignment, "You hear the world different, Elijah. Don't ever let that go." He didn't plan to. Music made sense when everything else didn't. It was the one language nobody could talk over. The one thing that didn't ask for permission or explanation. The Thursday before spring break, the school announced a special field trip, a community arts exchange at Bayside Prep, an elite private school across town. The announcement crackled over the loudspeakers, and the class groaned around him. Bayside was everything their side of Baton Rouge wasn't. Rich lawns, white blazers, lunch menus with sushi instead of sloppy joes. Elijah sat up a little straighter. He'd heard about Bayside's music program. Rumor was they had baby grand pianos in every music room. Real ones. Elijah had seen a piano once from the nosebleed seats at the concert hall when the school took them to see the Philharmonic. He didn't hear half the concert, too busy watching the pianist's hands move across the keys like they were pulling magic out of the air. Now he was going to Bayside. Maybe he'd get close enough to touch one. That night, Charlene ironed his best shirt, the one that was almost too small and had a faint stain near the cuff she couldn't scrub out. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You behave yourself tomorrow." "I will." "Don't touch nothing you ain't supposed to." "I won't." And he meant it. He really did. But music had a way of pulling him past promises, past rules, past good intentions. It was louder than anything else, even louder than the voice in his head that knew better. The night closed around Baton Rouge like a thick blanket. Somewhere across town, the streetlights buzzed to life. Elijah lay awake longer than usual, thinking about the keys he might see tomorrow, wondering what it would feel like to press down and hear something perfect ring out. He didn't know yet that one touch, one moment of reckless hope, was about to change everything. The bus ride to Bayside Prep didn't take long, maybe 30 minutes at most, but it felt like Elijah had crossed into another world. The second they rolled through the iron gates, everything changed. The grass was too green, the hedges too perfect, the sidewalks too clean. There were fountains spraying perfect arcs of water, courtyards with bronze statues of men holding scrolls and smiling like they'd figured everything out a long time ago. Kids in navy blazers stood around in tight little groups, laughing the way people do when they aren't worried about anything. Their shoes gleamed, and their backpacks didn't sag. Elijah stepped off the bus, gripping the strap of his own, feeling the way the world shifted under his feet. Inside, the floors shined so bright he had to blink. The air smelled like lemon polish and brand new paper. No graffiti, no cracked tiles, no teachers shouting from down the hall. Just this low hum of confidence that seemed to live in the walls. Elijah followed his class down hallways lined with framed art projects, real frames with real price tags underneath. One piece went for $200. He stopped for a second, staring. He could draw too. No one had ever offered to buy anything he made. They were herded into an auditorium where rows of Bayside students sat straight-backed and polished. An older man with silver hair welcomed them with a voice that sounded too smooth to be real, saying something about unity and creative expression and celebrating talent from all backgrounds. Elijah looked around and counted. Out of all the kids in the room, he was one of maybe 5 black students. The Bayside Jazz Ensemble played a short set. It was good, clean, every note right where it was supposed to be. But it felt too practiced, too polished, like the life had been rehearsed right out of it. Elijah sat stiff in his chair, listening. Not because he thought he wasn't good enough, but because he knew deep down that he could do something they couldn't. He could make the room breathe. After the performance, they broke into smaller groups. Elijah ended up in a songwriting workshop in room 208. He walked there with a handful of other kids he didn't know, half listening, as they cracked jokes about cafeteria food and their parents' Teslas. Room 208 was a music room like he'd never seen before. Floor-to-ceiling windows, soundproof walls, instruments lined up like soldiers ready for inspection. Guitars, violins, a cello in the corner. But the thing that caught Elijah's eye was the piano. A gleaming black Steinway Grand, lid open, keys so bright they looked like they could cut you if you touched them wrong. It was bigger than any instrument he'd ever been close to. The keyboard at the rec center didn't even deserve to be called the same thing. The instructor wasn't there yet. Most of the kids drifted to chairs without giving the room much of a glance. Elijah stood by the wall, eyes locked on the piano, not moving, barely breathing. A voice behind him cut through the moment. "Don't even think about it." Elijah turned. A tall boy with slicked-back blonde hair stood there, flanked by 2 others who looked like they practiced scowling in the mirror. The tall boy's blazer had a monogram stitched in gold, PJUW. "That's my dad's donation," the boy added, nodding toward the piano like it was his personal property. "You got anything like that in your neighborhood?" Elijah blinked, unsure if the kid was serious or just trying to get a rise out of him. "I wasn't going to break it," he said, voice low. "You sure about that?" The boy smirked. "Careful, those keys aren't made for dirty fingers." The words hit harder than a shove. A few students turned their heads, their conversations slowing just enough to catch the tension. Elijah felt the heat crawling up his neck, but he didn't move. His hands stayed at his sides. He wanted to walk away, to leave it alone, but then someone behind him snickered. That sound, sharp and ugly, pushed everything else out of his head. Elijah didn't remember deciding to move. One second he was standing there, trying to swallow the words down, and the next he was walking straight toward the piano. He heard a few gasps. Saw Preston. That had to be the tall kid's name, narrow his eyes in disbelief. Elijah reached the bench, pulled it out, and sat. His palms were damp. His throat was dry. But his fingers were steady. The room wasn't silent, but it was close. Conversations dropped to murmurs, chairs creaked as people shifted. The instructor still hadn't come in yet. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was something bigger than that. Elijah raised his hands above the keys. He hesitated, just for a breath. This wasn't the battered keyboard from the rec center. This was real, heavy, powerful. The kind of piano that could fill a room without even trying. He pressed a key. Soft, clean, perfect. A simple C that rang out like it had been waiting for him. Then came an E, then a G, building a chord he didn't need sheet music to know. His left hand followed, tracing a bass line, steady and low. His right hand floated back in, weaving a melody over it, something half remembered, half made up on the spot. The song didn't have a name. It didn't need one. It was the sound of every night spent alone in his room, listening to the world outside his window. It was the sound of Sunday mornings when Charlene sang softly under her breath, thinking nobody heard. It was the sound of every time he'd been told he wasn't enough, wasn't welcome, and decided to keep going anyway. The room shifted. Conversation stopped. The laughter dried up. Elijah wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself, for all the pieces of him that didn't fit anywhere else. He missed a note once, stumbled on a chord. It didn't matter. It wasn't supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be real. When he stopped, the room didn't react right away. It hung there, suspended, like the air didn't know what to do next. Then, quietly, someone at the back let out a low, shaky whoa. A few claps followed, hesitant at first, then stronger. Preston stood frozen, face unreadable, arms stiff at his sides. The door creaked open, and the instructor finally stepped in, clipboard in hand. She looked from Elijah to the stunned room, pausing like she'd walked into the wrong scene. "Did I miss something?" she asked. A kid near the front nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, voice almost awed. "You did." Elijah stood, pushing the bench back into place. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Elijah stepped into the hallway, still feeling the vibration of the last note humming through his fingertips. He didn't know if he should feel proud or terrified. He hadn't planned on playing. Hadn't even known if he could. But he had. And now everything felt a little different. Like the ground under him wasn't quite the same as when he walked into the building that morning. That's when he saw them. A small crowd had gathered outside the music room. Students from other workshops, a few teachers with clipboards and curious faces. Some looked surprised. Others looked impressed. Elijah didn't know what to do with any of it. But one face caught him and held him in place. Miss Delacroix, standing near the back of the group. She wasn't smiling wide. She didn't clap or call out his name. She just looked at him, eyes shining like she saw something she'd always known was there, but was finally getting to witness out loud. Elijah dropped his gaze, overwhelmed. She walked toward him, weaving through the loose circle of students like the world had narrowed down to only him. "You really played that?" she asked, voice low enough that it didn't feel like a demand. He nodded. "That was yours? That music?" He nodded again, afraid that if he tried to say it out loud, the moment might pop like a bubble. Miss Delacroix glanced past him, back into the room where the Steinway still sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Then she looked back at him, softer this time. "Elijah, that wasn't just good," she said. "That's something people remember." Before he could even start to process that, another adult approached. A tall woman in a gray blazer, clipboard tucked tight against her side. She bent slightly, meeting Elijah at eye level without crouching like he was a little kid. "I'm Mrs. Coldwell," she said. "I run the advanced music program here." He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He nodded instead. "I heard you from down the hall," she continued. "Have you ever taken lessons?" He shook his head. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Just practicing," he mumbled. "I play at the rec center sometimes, and at home when my brother lets me use his headphones." She smiled in a way that didn't feel fake or forced. "You've got something special," she said. "That kind of ear, that kind of expression. You don't teach that. You guide it. You nurture it." Behind her, Preston finally slipped out of the classroom, blazer wrinkled from leaning against the wall too long. He scanned the hallway, found Elijah, and for a second their eyes met. Neither one said a word. One of Preston's friends whispered something sharp and cruel and laughed, but Preston didn't laugh this time. His face was hard to read. Not angry, not smug, just unsure. Miss Delacroix touched Elijah's arm gently, pulling his attention back. Elijah, she said, how would you feel about playing something at the final performance this afternoon? He jerked his head up, startled. Me? Yes, she said. They always leave a spot open for a guest student at the closing assembly. I know, you should do it. He looked down at his sneakers, then back at her, then over at Mrs. Coldwell, that who was still watching him with the quiet kind of hope that felt almost heavier than pressure. A wave of nerves hit him like a second punch. Performing in a room full of kids was one thing. Playing for the entire auditorium, that was something else entirely. I don't know, he muttered. You don't have to, Miss Delacroix said, still gentle. But I think you'll regret it if you don't. He knew she was right. He nodded slowly. Okay. The teachers started moving away, conversations blooming around him again. The hallway, which had felt so tight a few minutes ago, opened up, folding back into the day. Elijah followed Miss Delacroix as she led him toward the performance hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. Halfway there, Preston's voice broke through the low hum of conversations. Elijah. Elijah turned. Preston was standing a few steps back, alone near the doorway. He looked like he wanted to say something. Maybe take back what he'd said earlier. Maybe pretend like none of it had happened. But instead, Preston just gave a small, awkward shrug and turned away. Elijah didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Later that day, the auditorium buzzed with the low energy of students drifting in from workshops, carrying snacks and water bottles, flipping through printed programs. Teachers clustered at the back, half watching, half chatting. The stage lights were already hot, making the polished floor gleam. Elijah waited behind the curtain, heart hammering, sweat prickling under his shirt. He hadn't changed. Still the same wrinkled button-up from this morning. Still the same scuffed sneakers. But somehow, he felt different, like the music inside him had changed shape since he sat down at that Steinway. Miss Delacroix found him just before he went on, speaking low and steady. They're gonna love you, she said. What if I mess up? Elijah whispered. You won't, she said. And even if you do, they'll still feel it. The announcer, a girl with a bright voice and steady smile, stepped to the mic. And now, she said, to close out today's celebration, please welcome a guest performer from Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, Elijah Brooks. Polite applause followed. Elijah walked out. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't try to find faces in the blur of lights. He just went straight for the piano, the same Steinway that had dared him earlier, waiting again like an old friend. He sat, took one breath, let his fingers settle without thinking too hard. And he played. Not the same melody from the workshop, something slower, something quieter. A song shaped by everything that had brought him here. The long nights, the thin walls, the busted rec center keyboard, the voices that doubted and dismissed and didn't see. The notes rose and fell like steps taken in the dark, unsure but moving forward anyway. He didn't need anyone's permission anymore. When the last note faded into the heavy stillness of the room, Elijah lifted his hands from the keys. For a second, there was no sound at all. No clapping, no shifting in seats. Just a pause, wide and open, like the whole auditorium had taken a breath and wasn't sure how to let it go. Then, a single clap from somewhere near the back. Another, closer. A few more picked it up. The applause wasn't thunderous. It wasn't the kind of movie moment where the whole crowd rose to their feet, cheering. But it was real, full, the kind of clapping that meant they'd felt something they hadn't expected to feel. Elijah stood, bowed without thinking, and moved off the stage quickly before the weight of it all could sink into his chest. In the hallway behind the auditorium, he leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. The noise of the applause still chasing after him like a ghost he couldn't outrun. A voice broke through the noise. That was incredible. Elijah turned. It was Preston. He was alone now. No friends flanking him. No smug look on his face. His blazer was buttoned neatly, his blonde hair a little less perfect. He didn't look angry or smug or defensive, just different. I didn't know you could do all that, Preston said. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't know what to say to that. Preston shifted, like he wasn't used to standing still for so long. What I said earlier, Preston said, voice lower now. I was out of line. Still, Elijah stayed quiet. I guess, Preston said, rubbing the back of his neck, I just didn't expect it. Elijah looked at him for a long moment and said quietly, "You didn't have to." Preston nodded once. Not a big nod, not a dramatic apology, just a small, awkward acknowledgement hanging there between them like a half-finished sentence. Then Preston turned and walked away, leaving Elijah alone in the hallway, the distant sound of clapping still echoing in the background. Miss Delacroix appeared a minute later, her face lit up with pride she didn't try to hide. "You did it," she said. Elijah managed a breathless laugh. "I think I did." She smiled at him, then glanced over her shoulder. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. Elijah straightened, nerves jumping all over again. Before he could ask who, a woman approached. Mrs. Coldwell. She still had the clipboard tucked under her arm, but now she wasn't looking at him like he was some curiosity. She was looking at him like he was an answer to a question she'd been asking for a long time. "I made a call," Mrs. Coldwell said. "Someone I know runs a summer arts program at the Baton Rouge School for the Arts. It's competitive. It's full scholarship. I think you'd be a perfect fit." Elijah blinked, not sure he heard her right. "I don't have money for lessons," he said quietly. "That's the point," she said, smiling. "You wouldn't need any. Everything would be covered. You just have to show up and play." He looked over at Miss Delacroix, who nodded like she already knew how badly he wanted to say yes. "I told her I'd talk to your mom," Miss Delacroix said. "She'll want to know." That night back home, Elijah sat on the couch, his backpack still slung over his shoulder, watching Charlene read over the brochure Mrs. Coldwell had given him. She held it in one hand, a half-burnt grilled cheese in the other. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Elijah could feel every thought rolling through her head. Finally, Charlene set the sandwich down and asked the one thing that mattered most. "They're not trying to use him for anything?" "No, ma'am," Miss Delacroix said from the other side of the table. "It's a real opportunity. They've done this for students across the state." Charlene looked over the paper again, scanning every word like it might change if she blinked. "And he'd stay where?" "In dorms. Supervised," Miss Delacroix said. "Just a few weeks. He'd be home by the end of summer." Charlene's eyes flicked to Elijah, who sat still, waiting. "You want this?" He met her gaze, steady. "I think I do." She sighed, a deep, low sound, the kind she only made when her mind was running ahead of her words. "He's 12, she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Still a baby." "I'll be careful," Elijah said, his voice almost a whisper. "You better." Charlene didn't give an answer that night, just said she'd think on it. That was more than enough for Elijah. A week later, a white envelope arrived in the mail with blue trim and Elijah's name typed neatly in the center. Inside was the formal offer, a place in the program, full scholarship, room and board included. Elijah read the letter 3 times before handing it to his mom. Charlene didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, handed the letter back, and went back to making dinner like nothing had changed, even though everything had. When the day finally came to leave, Elijah packed everything he owned that mattered into a duffel bag too big for his frame. Miss Delacroix picked him up in her car and drove him across town to the campus. On the way, she told him stories about other kids who had started just like him. Kids who had never touched a real instrument until they stumbled into places like this. Kids who had gone on to Juilliard, to Berkeley, to bigger dreams than anyone ever thought they deserved. "But none of them sound like you," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "And I mean that." The campus wasn't anything like Bayside. The paint peeled from the windowsills. The benches were worn smooth from years of waiting. But it felt honest. It felt right. On his first day, Elijah played in front of 3 instructors. They didn't ask where he came from. They didn't ask what he wore or what kind of car his mom drove. They asked him what key he felt most at home in. He thought about it for a second and said, D minor. They nodded like they understood. By the end of the first week, Elijah had written 3 new pieces. By the end of the second, he was teaching a classmate how to move through chord changes by feel instead of counting beats on their fingers. And somewhere deep down, for the first time in a long time, Elijah started to believe that maybe he was allowed to be exactly where he was. It was October when Elijah found himself walking through the iron gates of Bayside Prep again. But this time, there was no yellow school bus waiting at the curb, no matching t-shirts, no teachers hurrying kids into lines. He came alone, invited back by Mrs. Coldwell to perform at the school's annual fall recital. A surprise solo act, she had called it, a way to show the audience what raw talent could become when someone cared enough to nurture it. Elijah had grown a little since that spring day. His jeans fit better, not baggy at the ankles anymore. His curls were neater, kept short the way his mom liked. His hands, though, those had changed the most. They moved with a kind of quiet certainty now, as if they knew what they were capable of, even when the rest of him still doubted. The auditorium looked just like he remembered. The shiny floors, the heavy curtains, the rows of neatly lined chairs. But it didn't feel bigger than him anymore. It felt like a place he was supposed to be. In the front row sat Miss Delacroix, her purse perched carefully on her lap, her eyes following every move he made like she was memorizing it all. Next to her sat Charlene, wearing her best blouse, the one she usually reserved for church. Her hands clutched the edge of her seat so tight that Elijah almost smiled, because even though she was trying to look calm, he knew she was just holding herself together by sheer will. She hadn't been sure about this performance at first. "I don't know what people like that want from kids like you," she had said the night he told her. Elijah didn't have a perfect answer for her. He just said, maybe they just want to hear. Now, here she was, sitting in the front row, waiting to hear. The MC, a tall student with a clear voice and perfect posture, stepped up to the microphone and introduced him. Tonight's final performer is a young man who reminds us why music still matters. Please welcome Elijah Brooks. He walked out steady, not too fast, not too slow, not looking at the crowd. The Steinway was waiting for him at center stage, gleaming under the lights. This time, he didn't hesitate. He sat down, adjusted the bench once, and placed his hands on the keys. He didn't play the piece he had played back in the spring. This one was new. A piece he had written just 2 weeks earlier, late one night at the arts program, when the world outside his window felt too loud to sleep through. It had no title. It didn't need one. It started low, steady, like footsteps counted out in the dark. Then it climbed, measure by measure, into something warmer, something stronger. The melody didn't rush. It moved the way thoughts move when you're trying to make sense of a feeling you don't have words for yet. There were flourishes, small, quick runs of notes, but nothing showy. Every sound had a purpose. Every space between the notes mattered just as much as the notes themselves. Halfway through, he lifted his head briefly and caught a glimpse of Preston in the audience, sitting 3 rows back. Arms folded, not slouched, watching. Not smirking, not sneering, just watching. They hadn't spoken since that day in the hallway. They didn't need to. Some silences are heavy with things left unsaid. This one was filled with understanding. Elijah didn't look away. He let the connection linger for a second, then dropped his gaze back to the keys and let the music take over again. When the final note rang out, Elijah let it hang there in the air just long enough to let the whole room catch its breath. Then he lifted his hands slowly from the keys. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Not confusion, not hesitation. Just silence, the kind that falls when something real has been left in the room and nobody wants to be the first to break it. Then the applause came. Not polite, not scattered, real. Charlene stood up first. She didn't clap right away. She just stood there, staring at her son like she was trying to convince herself he was really hers. Then quietly, she smiled. After the show, people came up to him. Teachers, parents, a few students from Bayside. They asked where he learned to play like that. They asked what he was going to do next. Elijah answered as best he could, still a little uncomfortable with too much attention, still more comfortable behind the piano than in front of it. But one moment stayed with him more than the rest. A small boy, maybe 9 years old, skinny with big glasses that slid down his nose, walked up to him. He didn't say much, just whispered, "That made me want to try piano too." Elijah bent slightly and said, "You should." "I don't know how," the boy said, his voice barely a breath. "Doesn't matter," Elijah said. "Just start." The boy smiled, shy and wide, and that was enough. Later, in the car on the way home, Charlene was quiet. Elijah watched the streetlights blur past the windows, the city slipping by in broken flashes. "You okay?" he asked. Charlene nodded. "I just never thought I'd see something like that," she said after a long pause. "Not with your name on it." Elijah looked out the window again, voice low. "Neither did I. But maybe it had been there all along. waiting. Charlene didn't say anything after that. She just reached across the center console and placed her hand gently on top of his, not squeezing, not holding tight, just there. That night, after Charlene went to bed, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with a blank notebook open in front of him. He wasn't writing music this time, just words, scattered thoughts, lines he didn't want to lose. At the top of the page, he wrote, "You don't have to be invited to be allowed." The world hadn't given him permission to touch that piano. He'd taken it. And in doing so, he'd reminded them and himself that talent doesn't care where you're from, or what you wear, or how much your parents donated. It only cares that you listen when it calls. And now he knew. If you were waiting for a sign that you're allowed to try, this was it. Now go do it. By the time the bus pulled back into the parking lot of Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, the sky was streaked with gold, and the streetlights had started buzzing to life. Elijah sat near the back of the bus, forehead leaning lightly against the cool glass, watching Baton Rouge roll by in pieces. Fast food signs, corner stores, empty lots with bent fences. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. He hadn't said much on the ride back. A few classmates gave him high fives. Some asked how he learned to play like that. Jamari, one of the boys from his homeroom, had even joked, "Bro, you made rich kids clap. That's magic." Elijah smiled a little, but kept most of the feeling bottled up inside. There was something buzzing underneath his ribs, not nerves, not fear, something else he didn't have a name for yet. Miss Delacroix stood waiting at the bottom step of the bus as students filed out. When Elijah reached her, she touched his shoulder gently and pulled him aside. "Elijah," she said, lowering her voice, "that woman I introduced you to, Mrs. Coldwell, she wants to see you again." He blinked up at her. "Why?" "She runs a summer arts program, scholarship-based. She said it's rare to find someone like you who hasn't been formally trained." Elijah looked down at his sneakers, the left one scuffed along the toe. "I don't have money for lessons," he said automatically. "That's the point," Miss Delacroix said. "You wouldn't need any. Everything's covered. You just have to show up and play." He didn't know what to say. Opportunities like that didn't come to kids like him, not without strings, not without someone wanting something back. "I told her I'd talk to your mom first," Miss Delacroix added. "She'll want to know." That night, Charlene stood in the kitchen, holding the program brochure in one hand and a half-burnt grilled cheese in the other. Her face didn't say much, but her silence was loud enough to fill the whole apartment. "They're not trying to use him for something, are they?" she asked finally, looking over the top of the paper at Miss Delacroix. "No, ma'am," Miss Delacroix said. "It's a real opportunity. They've done this for students across the state." Charlene looked back down at the brochure. Elijah sat on the edge of the couch, backpack still slung over one shoulder, watching her like his whole future was balanced on the edge of her sigh. "And he'd stay where?" Charlene asked. "In dorms. Supervised. At Baton Rouge School for the Arts. Just a few weeks. He'd be home before the end of summer." Charlene stared at Elijah for a long moment. "You want this?" He nodded, the motion small but steady. "I think I do." She sighed deep and long, the way she did when she was trying to move past her fear. "He's 12, she said, almost to herself. "Still a baby." "I'll be careful," Elijah said, his voice barely a whisper. "You better." She looked at Miss Delacroix again, her expression caught between hope and worry. "I'll think about it." That was enough. That was everything. A week later, a white envelope arrived with Elijah's name printed neatly in the center. Inside was a formal offer letter. Full scholarship, room and board included, no tuition, no costs. Elijah read the letter 3 times before passing it to Charlene. She didn't say anything when she finished. Just nodded once and set it carefully on the counter like it was something fragile. They didn't make a big deal out of packing. Elijah stuffed everything he needed into a duffel bag that hung too heavy on his narrow frame. Miss Delacroix came to pick him up in her car. She told him stories on the way about other kids who had gone through the program, kids who had never touched a real instrument before, kids who had gone on to places with names like Juilliard and Berkeley. "But none of them sound like you," she said, "and I mean that." The Baton Rouge School for the Arts wasn't shiny like Bayside, the paint peeled on the windowsills, the benches were worn smooth from waiting too long in the sun, but the music room smelled like hope and hard work, not lemon polish. Elijah liked that. On his first day, he sat at a piano in front of 3 instructors who didn't ask him where he came from, or what car his mom drove, or what brand his sneakers were. They just asked, "What key feels like home?" He thought about it and answered, "D minor." They nodded, like they understood exactly what he meant. By the end of the first week, Elijah had written 3 new pieces. By the end of the second, he was helping another kid, a boy from Lafayette who couldn't read sheet music but could hum complicated jazz progressions like it was nothing, learn how to move through changes by feel instead of counting measures. Sometimes after dinner, Elijah would sit in an empty practice room with the lights dimmed low and just play whatever came to mind. Sometimes it was sharp and angry. Sometimes it was soft and slow, like a memory he didn't want to lose. One evening, after a long practice session, one of his instructors sat down beside him. "You know what I told my husband after I heard you play for the first time?" she asked. Elijah shook his head. "That's what talent looks like when it's unafraid." He didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure he believed it yet, but the words stayed with him, tucked away in the part of his chest that still ached with wanting. Even with new keys in his hands, even with doors swinging open in front of him, there was still something Elijah knew he had to do before any of it could feel fully real. Something that had been waiting for him, just like the music had. And soon enough, he was going to walk back through the doors at Bayside, not as a visitor this time, but as proof that talent, once it's found its voice, doesn't ask permission from anyone. The next time Elijah walked through the gates of Bayside Prep, he didn't come with a permission slip or a teacher hovering nearby. He wasn't one of many anymore. He was one. The fall recital was packed. Parents filled the rows. Students leaned against the back walls. Teachers clutched programs and whispered to each other. Elijah stood backstage, holding his breath, staring out through the tiny gap between the curtains. The lights were brighter than he remembered. The seats seemed closer. The room, for the first time, didn't feel too big for him. The Steinway sat in the middle of the stage, polished and waiting. It wasn't daring him this time. It wasn't daring him at all. It was welcoming him back. He smoothed the front of his shirt, the one Charlene had picked out, blue, crisp, no stains, and tried to ignore how fast his heart was moving. In the front row, Miss Delacroix sat with her purse on her lap, her whole face shining with something quiet and proud. Next to her, Charlene perched on the edge of her seat, hands clenched in a way that said she didn't trust herself to relax until this was over. Her best blouse looked a little too formal for the room, but she wore it anyway, like armor. The MC, a woman in a smart blazer with a steady voice, stepped up to the microphone. Tonight's final performer is a young man who reminds us that music isn't something you earn by where you're born. It's something you carry inside you. Please welcome Elijah Brooks. Polite applause rippled through the room. Elijah walked out, steady and sure, feeling every step but not questioning any of them. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. He didn't start right away. He let the moment stretch, let the silence fold itself around him until it felt like part of the music. Then he began. The piece wasn't the one he had played in the spring. It was new, something he had written in the last days of summer, when the world had started feeling bigger and smaller all at once. It began low, with slow, certain chords, building like footsteps through a city he almost recognized. It moved upward, brighter, stronger, finding its own light with every bar. It wasn't perfect. A few notes slipped under his fingers. A few measures ran faster than he meant them to. But it didn't matter. The music wasn't about being perfect. It was about being true. Halfway through, he glanced up, just for a second, and caught a glimpse of Preston sitting 3 rows back. Arms folded, face still, watching, really watching. They hadn't spoken since that spring. Elijah hadn't needed him to say anything. Some moments don't need words to be understood. He played through to the end, letting the final notes stretch out, not rushing to finish, not rushing to be done. When he lifted his hands from the keys, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of something bigger than him, bigger than the room. The applause started fast this time. Not tentative, not polite, real, full. A few people stood, clapping hard enough that Elijah felt it in his chest. Charlene didn't clap at first. She just sat there, looking at him like she was seeing him for the very first time. Then she smiled, slow and wide, the kind of smile that said more than any words could. After the recital, people came up to him again. Teachers, parents, even a few students from Bayside who looked like they didn't know what to say but wanted to say something anyway. Elijah answered when he could, nodded when he couldn't find the words. One moment stuck with him the most. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, wearing thick glasses and an oversized blazer, walked up shyly. "That made me want to try piano too," the boy said, voice almost too soft to hear. "You should," Elijah said, bending slightly to meet him at eye level. "I don't know how," the boy said. Elijah smiled. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Just start." The boy grinned, nodded hard, and darted back into the crowd. Later in the car, the city rolled past in a blur of streetlights and broken sidewalks. Charlene drove in silence for a while, then said, "I just never thought I'd see something like that. Not with your name on it." Elijah stared out the window, watching the night fold around them. "Neither did I," he said quietly, "but maybe it had always been there. Maybe it had just been waiting for someone to notice." Charlene didn't say anything else. She just reached across the console and rested her hand lightly on his, not to hold him back, not to pull him forward, just to say, without saying it, that she was there. That night, Elijah sat in his room with an old notebook spread out in front of him. Not writing music this time, just words, half-thoughts, promises. At the top of the page, he wrote, "You don't have to be invited to be allowed." The world hadn't handed him permission. It hadn't opened the door. It had barely even noticed him standing there. But Elijah had walked through anyway, because talent doesn't care where you're from. It doesn't care what you wear. It doesn't care what your last name is or how much your parents donated. It only cares that you listen when it calls. And if you're out there, wondering if you're allowed to dream, wondering if you're allowed to reach for something bigger, here's your sign. You are. Now go. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. It means more than words can say. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come not from being invited, but from daring to step forward anyway. Talent, dreams, and courage don't belong to any one kind of person. They belong to all of us if we're willing to listen and believe. If you enjoyed the story and would like to support our channel, it's really simple. Just hit the like button and leave us a comment below. We would love to know which country you're watching from and hear your thoughts about today's story. Your words inspire us to keep creating and sharing more stories that speak to the heart. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of the new stories we have coming your way. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us grow this community of listeners who believe in the power of hope, resilience, and dreams. Thank you again for being here. We can't wait to share more journeys with you.